So last time I talked about the HDMI output and recording it on Canon's EOS R5 and its immediate siblings. In this video, we're going to look at what's changed with the EOS R5 Mark II. Now, fortunately, most of the changes are, in fact, fairly minor, mostly consisting of moving things around in the menus. However, there are a few new functions that provide more control than Canon had provided previously, and Canon also has fixed the Log 3 color gamut issue. Canon's menus are constantly evolving, usually for the better, but that constant change means that settings move around as time goes on, which of course can be problematic in its own way. With that in mind, let's take a quick second to look at where the settings that I talked about in the previous video are now found in the menus on the R5 Mark II. HDMI Resolution is now found on page 3, or the Customized Display page of the yellow menu section, and HDMI Display and Standby Low Res are now on page 10, or the Assist Shooting /HDMI page of the red shooting menu. So actually, not a whole lot changed there. Moved a couple pages, and most things are grouped together, and the new menu names help you logically find things. With that said, that brings us to the new stuff. First of all, which is a new setting in the HDMI resolution. Now, previously the options were auto and 1080p. Now there is also an option for 1080i. Now, generally speaking, progressive frames, anything that's denoted with a P in the resolution, are preferred since they include all the lines for any given frame in that frame all at one time. However, in some cases, you may need to output interlaced fields instead of actual complete frames. This could be necessary, for example, if you're working in certain broadcast TV environments, and it can also be useful with some HDMI recorders to give you access to lower bitrate files if you're trying to stretch your record times. Specifically, what I'm talking about here are Atomos recorders, and those recorders record at the input frame rate only. So when the camera is set to 60 frames per second or outputs at 60 frames per second at 1080p, those recorders will record at 60 frames per second, even though that's maybe not what you want. That, of course, also means that they're using higher bit rates, and therefore you get bigger files. And of course, you don't see a huge improvement in image quality, or really any improvement in image quality, because you're just duplicating or recording duplicated frames. However, since those Atomos recorders support 3.2.2 and 3.2 pulldown with interlaced signals, sending them an 1080i or interlaced signal and using the right pulldown allows for the recorder to use a lower frame rate and therefore bitrate format. Now, I make this out to sound like it's pretty relevant or useful, but given the cost of storage, it seems a little bit of a reach to me to really care that much to do this to reduce file sizes by only around 33%. You're just not going to save that much. Now, also new to the R5 Mark II is a 17:9 aspect ratio DCI 2K recording resolution. Now, unfortunately, while the HDMI standards and the levels or grades that are used on the R5, or revision that's used on the R5 Mark II, supports a 2048 by 1080 resolution video signal, Canon's cameras don't actually output at that resolution on the HDMI port. When using the 2K DCI resolutions, your internal recordings are of course going to be made at 2048 by 1080 pixels. However, on the HDMI port, the 2K footage is actually scaled down to fit in a 1920 by 1080 standard full HD frame. This results in a 1920 by 1012 pixel image, which may not actually be what you want. Finally, there is a new HDMI output range for Canon or C.Log setting. This is found on the bottom of page 10 of the Assist Shooting HDMI page in the red shooting menu section. The HDMI output for C.Log setting controls the level range that's used when the camera is using the Cinema Log gamma curves. The options are either prioritize full range or full, and narrow range or narrow. Now, Canon's log gamma curves are designed for a full range signal, even though they don't use all 1024 levels that are available in a 10-bit file. When this is set to prioritize full range, the camera will use the full range primarily, or step down to the limited range signal if the device that it's reporting or connecting to claims that it can't handle a full range signal during the HDMI handshake. Now, when this is set to narrow range, the camera will adjust the log output to fit in the narrow broadcast legal range instead of the full range that it should be using. So with that in mind, the question is, why would you want to change this to narrow? Well, honestly, that's a good question, and about the best answer I can come up with is that if you were working with a capture pipeline that has been written with baked-in assumption about broadcast range data and what to do with sub-black and super white information, then the full range data that it's being sent in log form may be truncated or otherwise compressed or modified inappropriately. By forcing the camera to send narrow range data that's already been adjusted, it may make that kind of recording process or pipeline work a little bit better. Now, that said, in general, you don't want to use narrow range unless you absolutely have to. As best as I can tell, using narrow range reduces the dynamic range and potentially may also affect the tonal precision of log files being sent over the HDMI port. Now, when testing the R5, I found the HDMI output was limited to either BT709 or BT2020 color spaces. When Canon Cinema Gamut was selected on that camera, the camera would output BT2020 instead of the correct Cinema Gamut. On the R5 Mark II, this is no longer the case. When the camera is set to output Canon Log files, they are output in the Cinema Gamut just as they are recorded. Now, one last thing I wanted to touch on is recording time. On the R5, even with overheat protection set to standard, external recording gets you dramatically longer record times than you would see with internal recording. In my experiments and experience, I can consistently see run times in excess of 2.5 hours when shooting at either 4K 30HQ or 4K 60 in a about 77 degree Fahrenheit studio. If I'm recording internally, I see more like an hour or maybe even 30 or 40 minutes. With the R5 Mark II, my experience has been that the change is much less and much more variable. At the same temperatures and frame rates and resolutions, I have seen only between 40 and 80 minutes of runtime before the camera's overheat protection kicks in when I have it set to standard, even when I'm not doing any internal recording. This is purely on the HDMI side of things. With the R5 Mark II, it seems it's prudent, if you are doing external recording, to at least raise the overheat temperature threshold to high. This is done by changing the auto power off temp setting on page 10 of the Assist Shooting HDMI menu page in the red shooting menu. Additionally, Canon's CFR20EP cooling fan base or similar third-party active cooling solutions also really do seem like a good idea if you need really long run times at 4K, especially at 4K high quality, so fine, or 4K at 60 frames per second or even faster. Now, all told, using the R5 Mark II with an external recorder is not all that much different from Canon's earlier cameras. Canon has corrected the problem of the Cinema Gamut not being rendered properly on the R5 and has also added the ability to force Canon Log images into a broadcast legal range, even though doing so does cost highlight range in those. However, in the end, given the 6-hour recording limit and the cooling base requirement, or almost requirement for the cooling base, the question is, how relevant is HDMI recording today, or at least with this camera? The answer to that, as best as I can really come to, is that it depends. In the field, I am really hard-pressed to find any reason to use HDMI for recording like you might in past. About the only reason that I can come up with is that you can use ProRes instead of HEVC for your compression, though almost everything today supports hardware HEVC decoding, and Intel, Apple, and NVIDIA GPUs, at least the RTX 5000 series GPUs from NVIDIA, now support hardware decoding of 422 chroma subsampled videos, so HEVC really isn't the boogeyman that it once was in terms of performance and compression and all of that. Now that said, the real problem is that without active cooling, the R5 Mark II will still overheat, and do so fairly quickly even at 4K 60, which isn't nearly as nice as the case is on the R5. Now, arguably, the biggest reason to understand all of this comes down to the case of monitoring and streaming. Put simply, all of these settings, like usual, affect what's sent on the HDMI port, and what you do with that is really up to you. However, even if you're simply monitoring, you need to know what gammas and color ranges are being sent out on the port to your monitor, and this is especially true if you're using something like false color or zebra stripes to set exposures, as your monitoring display needs to know how to translate the raw brightness levels that it's getting from the HDMI signal into what should be the correct exposure ranges for the selected gamma curve that you're working in. That said, I hope you found this useful, or at least interesting. If you did, let me know by hitting that like button. Also, if this kind of thing seems like it might be your kind of thing, please consider subscribing if you haven't already. Finally, if you'd like to help and support this channel, you can help us for free by liking this video, sharing it with your friends, and leaving a comment with your experiences. Likewise, you can support us by hitting that thanks button or buying yourself something you've always wanted from one of the affiliate links in the description below. And as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.